Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the Economic Justice, COVID Recovery and the Dawn of Divergence episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. And this week we'll be looking at the National Minimum Wage Review, Contradictory UK Travel Restrictions, SRD Grant reforms, and the President's visit to Msikaba Bridge, and the first meeting of heads of RECs, the AUC response to the failed coup in Sudan and terrorist attacks in Burundi, and the African health gap. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
No, everything is fine, Sia. Thank you. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. I can't complain. And with us this week as well is Uzama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. Hello, Zama. How are you this week?
Hey there, Sia. I'm well, thanks. And you? How you doing, Spoo? It's great to be back.
Well, thank you.
Very well, thank you, Zama. We missed you as always, and welcome back this week.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm happy. I'm so happy.
Glad you're with us. On that note, let's get started with our episode this week. Our first story is NMW Commission calls for comment. The National Minimum Wage Commission is inviting all interested parties to submit written comment on the possible adjustments to the minimum wage for 2022 by the 1st of October 2021. The NMW Commission, National Minimum Wage Commission, will consider all inputs before it publishes its annual report and recommendations on the annual review of the minimum wage later this year. In February 2021, the Minister of Employment and Labour, Mr. Tembelani Valdemar de Tula Singlesi, announced that the minimum wage for each ordinary hour worked has been increased from 20 Rand 76 to 21 Rand 69 cents, which effectively provides a 4.48% increase on the previous minimum wage, and has been in effect since the 1st of March 2021. Zama, you had a few questions and comment about this one.
Yes, yeah. I have a question around the possible adjustments that might, be proposed. I was wondering what possible adjustment interested parties would propose other than the minimum wage being set higher.
Yeah, so there typically are differentiations. Well, the fights are always going to be ideological when it comes to the national minimum wage, mainly because the opponents of it feel that it raises the reservation wage and therefore leaves certain workers who would be willing to work for less than that without work, just simply because there are fewer people or people who cannot afford the level at which the minimum wage is set. And obviously the proponents of the national minimum wage would argue that it's desirable and necessary in order to set a floor for wages so that they wouldn't go below a certain level, in order to maintain also livable wages in the country. And obviously then the tussle and the fight is going to be about the levels at which we're adjusting the increase, and it's possible to also have a decrease depending on things like inflation, etc. But typically what we see is a steady increase in the minimum wage, which is also aligned with the steady improvement in living conditions for the lowest wage earners. So apart from that, the inputs could also come in terms of further differentiation, such as the sectoral determinations, which differ from the actual level at which the minimum wage is set. So the minimum wage sets a floor across the board, and then there are sectoral specific determinations which apply to specific sectors in terms of a minimum wage according to that sector. So there are two levels at which the sort of inputs will be required or will be expected, at a cross-cutting level as well as at a level of specific sectors. Smoo, you also had a comment and further inputs about this one.
Yes, I concur with you, and just would add that there will be a push from proponents of unbridled free market fundamentalism against the usual annual increase. But most importantly, it will be against the minimum wage regime itself. Like you say, it will be philosophical. What they will also be put as an excuse is that the COVID-19 pandemic hit businesses hard. But if you dig deeper, you'll know that what informs their philosophy is the historical treatment of labor resources in this country. So one can go way back to the slave trade by the VOC, which is the Dutch East India Company, and then the British Empire, which also introduced indentured labor. Then there was the migrant worker system with reserves in the Bantustans, and the DOP system, which was used in the winelands. So the objective, however, if you want to square things down, the objective should always be to drive towards better living standards for everyone, for all. You do this by injecting spending power in your population. This is good for creating demand for your goods and services. It's actually a boost for the economy. I mean, the spirit of our constitution is that we must have a society that is fair and equitable. Equity and fairness is what is inscribed. So what we should be doing, it should be to integrate the whole population upwards, not downwards, not this downward spiral to the bottom, which creates a working poor class that cannot afford the basic necessities that the economy produces, or just basic necessities for needed for living. I mean, income distribution through wages is one way of countering the extreme inequality that is found in South Africa. And we're not even talking about wealth inequality this time. We're just talking about distribution of incomes. Things like land and natural resources will come in later. That's another topic. So I don't see how people can reject this.
Yes, I think definitely. But, as we know, most of these economic debates depend on one's class position in many cases. On that note, let's move on to our next story from the SA Update. Contradictory UK Restrictions. Minister of Tourism Ms. Lindiwe Nongceba Sisulu has thanked the German government for removing South Africa from its COVID-19 red list. Meanwhile, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperations Ms. Grace Naledi Mandisa Pandor has expressed disappointment at the fact that the United Kingdom UK decided to keep South Africa on its red list. All travelers entering the UK after having visited South Africa in the prior 10 days will be required to take a pre-departure COVID-19 test within 17 hours before traveling, book a 10-day full quarantine in a management quarantine hotel, and book 2 additional COVID-19 tests to be taken on or before the 2nd and on or after the 8th day of quarantining. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
I have to echo the sentiments of Minister Pandor. I am so disappointed that we are still on the red list. And, I actually find it strange considering the sort of relationship that South Africa historically has with the UK and currently even still has. But obviously, if I'm going to play devil's advocate, you have to note, obviously, that the country has to look out for its own people. They were in close proximity to countries such as Italy. Europe was, in terms of COVID-19, Europe was very hard hit by COVID-19. And South Africa, actually, I'm thinking in South Africa's favor, we actually sort of came down with hard lockdown measures faster than other countries like the UK. So they were really hard hit. So I understand from that perspective. However, I'm trying to understand really though, like when we actually look into it, that, I understand that maybe not all countries have reached, in Africa have reached a certain vaccination level or anything like that. But I'm trying to really comprehend what does the real reason that South Africa would be currently placed on the red list. And I think that's my concern, and that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, because it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, I'm trying to get to the bottom of that. Maybe you can help me. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think Smoo's comment might actually elucidate some of the reasons, and I don't want to speculate off the bat. I think let's start off with some of the science. Over to you, Smo.
What my comment was, I'm just imagining if you are a standard family of 4 and have to foot a hotel bill for 2 adults and 2 kids. I mean, the quarantine on arrival makes travel, especially for leisure and tourism, very, very expensive. For starters, the UK is South Africa's biggest tourism market, and this this listing affects an industry that is already bleeding from 18 months of very little revenue. And so to answer Zama's question, what Minister Lindiwe Zulu, the tourism minister, says is that the British government believes the Beta variant, which apparently circumvents all vaccinations of the coronavirus, is a South African variant. Now, look, by the looks of things, I think more dialogue or engagement is needed between scientists from both countries, sort of like to convince each other. I mean, this business about this variant being a South African variant, that's where it all lies.
Oh my gosh.
On that note, let's move on to our next story in the SA update. SRD grants from retailers. The South African Post Office SAPO has announced that approved recipients of the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress SRD grant can now collect their benefit from Pick n Pay and Boxer stores nationwide from the 22nd of September. The distribution of SRD grants through the retailers is expected to relieve pressure on post offices. Beneficiaries will never be asked to enter personal information on their cell phones or to click on any link, and beneficiaries are warned to stay vigilant against any fraudulent requests for personal information as part of these reforms. Zama, you had a comment on this one.
Oh, yes. I was just saying that I'm really proud of the turnaround that the post office is showing after a change of leadership. I think the post office is coming along really well and should continue to push barriers. And I think this is a positive development in creating efficient ways in which our country can serve its people. So I just think this is wonderful.
Spoo, what are your thoughts?
I think it's all fine. Like Zama says, I'd say the more outlets, the better. This initiative makes sense in that the retail sector is the biggest beneficiary of the country's social welfare programs. All of them, of the money goes to food. But I would say I think the banking sector should have been hauled before Parliament for their lack of solidarity. There is one or maybe 2 banks. These make it possible for the unbanked to open up accounts without a deposit. It also points to the lack of financial sector monitoring and regulation by what some call a haughty reserve bank that does not put the country's developmental needs at the center. But then there's the Post Bank, which was meant to have evolved into a fully fledged commercial bank, sort of like a decade ago. My question is, why didn't the South African Reserve Bank facilitate this? I am on the side of those who say we need a more agile, more activist central bank, one that is enterprising and acts proactively in search for societal solutions. They should be using their policies and their regulatory tools that they have at hand. I mean, they should be doing in conjunction with their principals, the National Treasury, doing some of the legwork. I think there's a miss somewhere. I mean, yeah, it's okay for Boxer and Pick n Pay to to be beneficiaries of this, but we should be building towards something that is more beneficial to the entirety of this society.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more with you. And what you're raising is linked to the issue of financial inclusion. Because let's be clear, these retailers aren't doing this as a matter of benevolence. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They know for a fact that, like ShopRite has done with the social grants and allowing people to access social grants through ShopRite, they will capture some of this through consumption of the recipients, right? And what this does, and I think it's better that we're adding more retailers to the network, but what this does is it locks out a huge economy, particularly township economy and the informal retail economy, that cannot provide similar access to grant recipients. And there is talks, and I think I've seen a paper written which is trying to consider whether financial products like mobile money could be a way to further increase financial inclusion, whilst also providing access for the non-traditional players in the sector, such as the informal traders and the informal sector, which is locked out from these formal avenues for distribution of things like grants, etc. And you're right, especially in a country like South Africa, where the industry is highly formalized and there's very high barriers for entry to new players. This needs to be at the forefront of all policymakers, because effectively now the competition is between Boxer, ShopRite, and Pick and Pay as to where the recipients of social grants are going to spend their money. And obviously the first port of call will be these retailers, and that leaves a huge chunk of the informal sector out of the pie or not included. And I think whether that be through a state bank or mobile money, the South African government really needs to think significantly about how to expand financial inclusion in a way that enables grants to also reach the informal sector, especially the informal retail sector, because these are economies that also rely, particularly in the township economies, on this grant ecosystem.
Yes. Yep.
On that note, that brings us to the last story in the SA update. President visits Msikaba Bridge. President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa led a visit to the Msikaba Bridge at Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape on 23 September 2021 to assess the development of infrastructure. The 1.65 billion rand Msikaba Bridge is part of the N2 Wild Coast Road project aimed at stimulating investment and growth, initiating new economic sectors, and transforming the connection of rural communities to urban centers around the country. This project is one of the piloting of the Intergovernmental District Development Model, which enables all three spheres of government, public entities, and community stakeholders to take ownership of the progress towards infrastructure investment. Zama, you had a comment about this one.
Yes, yeah, I'm just pleased to see this development, because personally, I've always expressed concerns about the state of the Eastern Cape province in South Africa, as well as Northern Cape to an extent. And I really feel as though those provinces are heavily neglected in South Africa. Obviously, places like Gauteng, Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga seem to be more of hubs, although Eastern Cape does have, and Northern Cape have their own attractions and such, but I definitely think they also have quite a number of strong developmental issues. So I'm happy to see an effort intensify around the economic developments in areas such as Eastern Cape, which have great potential to contribute to the broader long-term economic growth of the country. And I see that it's actually quite a huge investment, actually, when we actually look at the numbers.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there, especially on the spatial development and the need to transform the spatial legacy of apartheid in the country. Sbu, you had a couple of observations. What are your thoughts?
Well, the president, for starters, the president took a litany of national government ministers. He took the premier of the province, and he took district mayor. It shows that all spheres are working together, sort of like what this entire district model is all about. But now at the center of it is stakeholder ownership of development. This project was put on hold due to the dissatisfaction of the Amadiba communities. Now, they set up the Amadiba Crisis Committee to represent the communities and demanded that the road be moved 10 kilometers inland to prevent coastal villages from being cut up by the highway. And so the construction this proposed construction brought instability and tensions in the area, with some members of this agricultural community looking to benefit from the sales of land, while others oppose the impact of the construction on their livelihoods because they would lose their farmland. Now, this district development model should be a model that brings in a paradigm change. Communities or stakeholders should not only be engaged, but they must become a vital cog to drive development. In the vicinity, there's also the Msikaba Bridge project, which came to a halt also when the contractor stopped working and moved off-site due to community unrest. Now, this Msikaba Bridge will be the highest bridge in Africa, 260 meters at its maximum height, and it will cost about 3.5 billion rand, and will be completed by 2025 or 2026. So when the president was there, he made promises to the communities that local businesses would benefit from the procurement, and that 30% of the procurement would be set aside for locals. And he's promised that 36,000 jobs will be created, and the total amount, this Msikaba Bridge and the Msikaba would bring about 4 billion rand that will be pumped into the local economy. I can imagine all the applauses from government officials and locals licking their lips. I mean, it's one of those. I mean, but now one wonders: is it development really, or is it also a bit of politicking? I mean, elections are around the corner too, so. Well, but development is always welcome. But my main point really, Sia, is that development, communities must be at the center. There wouldn't have been all of these halts and the unrest and all of that if the people were put at the center from the onset. Yeah.
Very true, Sbo. And a large part of the delays with this project have been due to this community engagement and just the development facilitation, which a lot of the entities also in government are just ill prepared on how to deal with this. And it was precisely one of the reasons why the DBSA was actually created in the past, and it played a significant role in quelling these contentious political issues around local governance. For example, in the issues that we've also discussed prior on the show, regarding to local municipal uprising and protests in Stutterheim, for example, another part of the Eastern Cape. The DBSA was central in playing part the balancing role between the traditional authority, the municipal authority, as well as the local community in terms of how to distribute the gains and benefits from development. And it's no wonder this project has faced this, because any project that's looking at rural transformation in the country is going to come across the problem of contradictory land governance in this country. The fact that in urban areas, there's obviously the title deed or private ownership of land, whereas in rural areas, the distinct defining factor of rural in South Africa is the fact that the land is under custodianship of traditional leaders and is communally owned. And this issue keeps coming up in how we deal with it under the Ngonyama Trust, as well as how further developments focused on rural transformation will deal with it. And it'll be interesting to see how the ruling party balances this along with its other process of the constitutional amendment of section 25, looking at expropriation of that compensation, because this process needs to happen without any glitches, whilst also the legislation is being written which precisely affects the impact and how these gains are distributed. So definitely rural transformation and rural development is something that is laudable and we can always applaud, but it also brings us head on with the developmental contradictions of an unequal or inconsistent land governance model in South Africa, this bifurcated model of rural-urban land divide. So it'll be interesting how these things play out. On that note, that brings an end to our essay update this week, and that takes us to the Africa regional update for this week. Our first story is the first meeting of heads of RECs. The East African Community Secretary General, SG, Honorable Dr. Peter Matuki, urged the African Continental Free Trade Area AfCFTA Secretariat to adapt an integration approach that is people-centered, market-driven, and private sector-led, and to ensure African citizens benefit from the Continental Agreement. Speakers at the first coordination meeting of heads of regional economic communities, RECs, on the implementation of the AfCFTA in Accra, Ghana, the AACSG noted that the continental market promises to unlock many opportunities African citizens should benefit from. The meeting also highlighted the importance of collaboration between the AfCFTA Secretariat and the RECs to ensure effective implementation of the AfCFTA, as well as the role of private sector in unlocking the potential of the AfCFTA. Sbu, you had a comment about this one and a few questions.
Yeah, well, see, I'm puzzled by contradictions. You were talking about contradictions in the past story. Contradictory terms used in the statement. Words like people-centered, and then they say market-driven, and then they say private sector-led, and then they say gains trickle down to Africans. No. Yeah, this is all neoliberal speak in my view. No, and when they say if it barks like a neoliberal, then it must be a neoliberal. And African leaders have bought into the hegemonic narrative of keeping the state away from development, or keeping the state away from active participation in the economy. Some even quote the 18th century economist Turgot, Mr. A.R.J. Turgot, in his writings, who said, "It seems that public finance, like a greedy monster, has been lying in wait for the entire wealth of the people." Now, on the one hand, you can politically page how mean never materialize, or it can mean exorbitant costs. Like here in the Eastern Cape, we have the Umzimvubu Dam project, which was supposed to have been built way back in the 1960s, back in 1962 to be exact. That project is still at conceptualization stage because it is market-driven, and there are no off-take agreements with rural towns and communities in that area. We also, on the other hand, we also have the Gauteng electronic tolling system, which is unworkable. It became too expensive to operate and to administer because, once again, it was market driven. In South Africa's case, you have a government that has put up government guarantees to de-risk the Gauteng e-toll. It was a PPP, it was a private-public partnership project. Sanral was the state-owned entity, the conduit. There are fears that government guarantees, may be called up due to non-payment because people are boycotting the e-toll system. It's a very unpopular model. So, all in all, in this case, I would suggest that there be a supranational institution that can issue bonds. Maybe these can be securitized to create elements of safety. I mean, institutional investors have an appetite for infrastructure. It is a high profit yielding asset class. But now there's the risk of a level. Now the risk, that's what tends to increase the cost of investment. So when it comes to repayment, you have to factor in all of those risk costs, and it can make these projects or developments very costly. So for trickle down, I don't know what they mean about trickle down. Maybe they mean the cost, because that's what will trickle down to the citizens. The citizens will be only able to use the infrastructure depending on their ability to pay. So as in Johannesburg, people use bypass, you use other roads, and they don't use the e-tolls, and they just flatly refuse to pay. It's very interesting. It's very, I don't know. See ya.
Sure. So I can sense your frustration. But I want to hand over to Zama before I weigh in on this one. Zama, you had a few observations as well.
Yes, I completely agreed with Spoo's views, and I think we share, similar sentiments, because I feel that the idea is all good and well. So how can we ensure such an approach, or firstly from that perspective, and then I go into how do we ensure such an approach when we fighting disease, hunger, poverty, violence, economic and political instability all the time. So I'm saying that the agreement needs to be practical in nature and not idealistic, and I hope that countries are able to back it up and back up what they say, how this approach needs to be, and that's and not be on this sort of neoliberal wave, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Oh, guys, look, there's just so much to unpack here, and particularly because I'm quite passionate about regional integration. So let me give it a try. It's not as though governments don't have a role, they have a critical role to play. But governments cannot play a role and cannot play the whole role entirely, because there needs to be the last lever, which is the private capital investment, which on the continent hasn't been developed, and I think that's largely due to two reasons. One is the colonial legacy, the fact that domestic capital was pretty much, through dispossession of people, destroyed, but also majority indigenous populations were excluded from commerce during colonialism. I mean, that was the whole nature of the relationship. And in post-colonialism, because we still depend on commodities, which have leverage on the existing investment made by, and if you look at the large capitals or even multinational capital that's operating in the space, you're talking British Petroleum, you're talking the Dutch Shell company, etc., which are all linked to the colonial past. And similarly, when you look at mining, you're talking, for example, Anglo-American, which is, another big sort of dinosaur of colonialism between the British and the Americans in South Africa. De Beers, for example, similar type of context. So the point is, there's very little, if any, domestic private capital on the continent So this notion that a private sector is going to flourish overnight, for me, is very problematic. And I don't
Yes,
think
yes.
that, despite the attempts we've made in order to attract investors and all of this, FDI hasn't been able to play that role. So foreign capital is not going to be able to play that role. At the same
Exactly.
time, because we've got very little existing capital, we don't have the experience and the expertise to grow it so that it can also compete with global capital. So the big elephant in the room is, how are now African countries and governments going to support the investment and development of private capital? And obviously, there's a first mover advantage with these things, as always. And the fact is, no matter what we do, African countries, as a recipients of less than 5% of global foreign direct investment, we're never going to be able to compete with places like Silicon Valley and huge venture capital funds, which are needed in order to spur on innovation and creativity that is needed to establish private capital on the continent. So, yeah, it is a difficult role. And at the same time, we still see a lot of African governments and countries still depending quite heavily on informal sector and informal trade, contributing quite a large portion of how many
Yes.
African citizens still earn an income. So
Yeah.
it's both a question about how do we develop that informal sector and formalize it, but at the same time, how do we create legislation that can still support the informal sector without forcing this formalization on it that actually destroys the creativity that exists in the very little private capital that exists in the form of informal sector on the continent. And it's that tightrope that governments need to walk as we try to realize the benefits and potential of the Africa Continental Trade Agreement. On that note, that brings us to the next stories on the Africa continent, which are relating to one failed coup in Sudan and a terrorist attacks in Burundi. So there was a failed coup in Sudan on the 21st of September, to which the African Union Commission chairperson, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, has strongly condemned and congratulated the endurance of Sudanese people against this failed attempt. At the same time, there were attacks involving a grenade explosion in Bujumbura, capital of Burundi, on the 22nd of September. These attacks have left 5 people dead and several injured. Again, the chairperson of the African Union Commission has condemned the criminal acts and urged authorities to bring the responsible perpetrators to justice. Zama, you had a few questions about the case of Sudan.
Yes. So, when the AUC chairperson, urged adherence to the legitimate authorities of the transitional period, I think to myself, who are the legitimate authorities of the transitional period, really? My thing is, a coup was attempted for a reason. So I'm worried about the legitimacy of these so-called legitimate authorities.
That's, yeah, a very salient point you raised there, Zama, and it links to our discussion of the similar story on Sudan last week, actually. And I think I want to hand over to Sbu, who has a comment that reflects on this.
Yeah, you're right, Sia. We were talking about this last week. We talked about the joint civilian and military government. That's the legitimate authorities. It's the joint civilian and military government. They formed this transitional government. They face economic and security challenges. We talked about how they had quelled violence in Darfur, and our question was, what about Kordofan? What about the Blue Nile? What about in the Nuba Mountains? Anyway, some segments of the population have lost patience with the government. And last week we did say that the IMF, the IMF structural reforms and their bite have a propensity to result in destabilizing countries. So people are just fed up with a rising cost of living, fuel, cost go doubling and fuel prices doubling because subsidies have been done away with, things like that.
Yes, and we even noted, I think, in our story last week, Zama, that there's been a slow movement towards preparing for the election as part of the Khartoum Agreement, which
Yes. Yes.
the UN mission noted as quite a concerning fact about the slow transition in Sudan. And this
Precisely.
leads me to some of the questions you had about Burundi.
Yes. So when it comes to Burundi, I know that we also recently covered a story on Burundi. So when it comes to the terrorist attacks, do we know what terrorist group this was? And I'd have another question around whether the attacks were politically motivated or perhaps maybe motivated for any other reasons.
Smoo, you want to hazard
Yep.
a response to this?
Yeah, there's an organization, a group, a rebel group called Red Tabara. They are the main suspects, according to reports. The group claimed the responsibility for the Bujumbura airport explosion on Saturday, but there were no casualties there. Yeah, you're also correct. A few months ago, we mentioned this group, and it was formed 10 years ago, and it has its base in South Kivu in the eastern DRC. Yeah.
On that note, that brings us to our last story on the Africa Regional Update, the Africa Health Gap in Focus. Speaking on the sidelines of the 76th UN General Assembly, African Development Bank President His Excellency Akin Adesina asserted that Africa cannot outsource its health to the rest of the world. The sentiments were echoed by the World Trade Organization Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and the Global Infrastructure Partners Vice Chairman and Partner Dr. Jim Yong Kim during a panel discussion looking at the balancing the scales of global health and the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. This follows recent reports that only 3% of the African population has been vaccinated, with only 3 countries that have reached the target of 40% of their population. But on that note, that brings an end to our Africa Regional Update this week. And this brings us to the numbers game. The number for this week is 4.9%. Zama, do you want to hazard a guess what this number relates to?
Oh my gosh, this number. I actually don't know. Isn't this like the percentage that like fuel has increased by? I swear fuel has definitely increased.
Yes. I think very, very close. I think this is the closest we've come, actually. But close, but no cigar. Smoo, do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I think that is the projected GDP growth for the year. I think I saw that number.
Which country
Yeah.
are you
Oh,
living
right.
in? 4.9%. Wow. Okay.
You know, the Reserve Bank governor said they are projecting something like 5.3% for the year. That's
Okay.
growth. So
Possible.
that's why I said
I think that number is grossly over exaggerated.
myself.
No, I definitely don't think we're going to be surpassing. I mean, we've been registering quarterly growth or seasonally adjusted quarterly growth at around 1%, 1 and 2%.
2%, yeah.
But we'll
And the
have
next
to
And I
watch
thought
and
to
see.
myself, it would have to be something like 8% for the next quarter. I don't know. Anyway.
I highly doubt that.
I don't know.
The number is actually CPI rises to 4.9% in August. So the South African Consumer Price Index CPI rose to 4.9% year on year in August 2021, following a 4.6% in July 2021. The main contributors to CPI were transport, which increased by 9.9%, contributing 1.4 percentage points, and food and non-alcoholic beverages, with increased by 6.9%, contributing 1.2 percentage points, and housing and utilities, which increased by 3.8%, contributing 0.9%. and all expenditure deciles except for levels 6 and 7 faced inflation above the monthly average in August. So there you have
Geez,
it.
Zama, yeah,
You're
Zama,
very
you were
close there,
close,
Zama.
and I was not even in the
Feel it. I can
stadium.
feel these numbers, certain numbers just make sense. You know, when you're pouring petrol, then you see that it's not like before. And then you notice,
Okay.
yes.
Definitely. I think Zama is an aware consumer. So there you have it, folks. Inflation ticking up slightly, and as you know, the Reserve Bank decided to keep the repo rate unchanged this month. And I think it's on the back of these slightly increased but still moderate levels of inflation, given that the band is 3 to 6% that we're targeting as a country.
Yes, yeah.
On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week.